I'm going to be. So we do have a smaller group than usual today. I'll keep an eye out to see if some folks join us as we go. I can't help but wonder if it has something to do with the choice of the movie, more than just random that we're so much smaller today. But welcome. I'm glad to have you guys with me, and more room for other people to talk, perhaps, if we're a smaller group. So we'll see how it goes as we go along. We're talking about Inglorious Bastards today from 2009, directed by and written by Quentin Tarantino. So, and as you know, I paired this movie with Schindler's List, and throughout all the time that we've been watching movies, I sort of devised this program in terms of pairs. And I put these two together, not just really because of their themes related to the Shoah, but for a couple of other reasons as well. I mean, one is that I think we're really talking about two of the most popular, prolific, and influential directors of the 21st century, 20th and 21st century, in Steven Spielberg and Quentin Tarantino, both of whom are steeped in the history of movies and make their films often have a text that has to do with movies themselves. I mean, that's particularly explicit here in Inglorious Bastards, but we see it in Spielberg. You see it in a movie like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and the homage that it pays to the old movie serials, back in the 1930s. So both of these directors are very much a product of growing up watching movies and really absorbing the lessons that movies gave them and bringing them into their films. The other reason I paired these two is because they strike me as being quite opposite to each other in their treatment of the topic, and I think that's kind of fascinating. And we talked about last week with Spielberg that one of his explicit goals in making Schindler's List was to counteract the arguments of Holocaust deniers, right? To make a film that looked so much like a documentary that it would actually work on that level for people. And in fact, as I mentioned last week, research shows that it did, that even people who had some skepticism or at least lack of knowledge about the Holocaust going into Schindler's List came out convinced, right? So, and the last thing I think I said last week before we finished was that we are lucky that the most influential director of a generation decided to make a movie that proves that the Holocaust actually happened, right? Because if we depend on our fiction films for history, then that's, then Steven Spielberg did us a great service by creating this movie, which is based on fact, but also, as we talked about, it has fiction in it in Schindler's List, rather than what Quentin Tarantino did, which is make a movie which, as one of the characters actually says, right? I think a movie about Jewish revenge, right? This is the face of Jewish vengeance, says near the end. So I think it's just fascinating, in that sense. Quentin Tarantino, of course, makes this up out of whole cloth, right? There is the only things in this movie that have any resemblance to actual facts are some of the names of actors and directors that actually appear in the movie, right? On the movie marquee in the movie theater in occupied France is those are real, right? But other than that, there's nothing true about this movie at all, right? And of course, sort of the genius of it, in a sense, is how it works against our expectations of what a movie about World War II and a movie about the Holocaust can be. right? I don't know about you, I remember watching it the first time and kept expecting for this plot to fall through, right? Because obviously we know historically that Adolf Hitler killed himself in a bunker at the end of World War II. He did not die being shot by Jewish soldiers in a movie theater in occupied France, right? So, my expectation of movies is that those kinds of rules couldn't be completely rewritten, right? And in some sense, that's the genius of this movie, but also perhaps its danger, in the sense that if we look to movies to be our history lesson, then people come away from this movie with a very inaccurate picture, of course, of what happened historically, right? So I don't know whether anybody did any research on this movie the way they did on Schindler's List to see whether people now think that Hitler actually died in a movie theater, right? So, but it would be interesting to know if some people took the wrong impression from this. And it was that Tarantino, since making this movie, some of you may have seen his more recent movie, which also has Brad Pitt in it, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where he does virtually the same thing on a smaller scale, right? He undoes the Manson murders. I'm sorry to give away some endings from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It came out several years ago, so hopefully if you wanted to see it, you've seen it already. But and I think that it works better in this film, Inglorious Bastards, than it does in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, primarily because it's so unexpected in this movie. But then when he uses that sort of contrivance again in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it starts to feel like a familiar trope, right? Rather than a kind of almost transgressive sort of force that I think it has in this movie. So let me say a little bit. I won't say that much about the actors and directors in this movie. A line here and there. Tarantino himself was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1963. He moved with his mother to Torrance, California when he was 4 years old. Famously, he, while trying to make it as a writer and director of movies, he worked in a video store and, according to the stories, watched every video in the place while he was becoming a movie director and writer himself. So the video store was his film school. He didn't go to USC Film School or anywhere else. He is a self-taught movie maker, as many generations of filmmakers before him were self-taught, right? The idea of going to film school and learning to be a filmmaker is a relatively modern thing. And, so he's sort of a throwback in some ways. He became a director by watching movies. But you might be interested in knowing, if you don't know, that he's married to an Israeli actress and model named Daniela Pick. And I know that Vanessa showed me something a while back that he's been studying Hebrew and spending time in Israel. So we'll see where, if that has any more influence on his career than at the time that he made this movie back in 2009. So the title of the movie itself is borrowed from an Italian war movie that was made in 1978. This is not the only time in his career that Tarantino borrows names and titles from other things. Some of you may have seen Django Unchained. That also comes from an Italian spaghetti Western. So he takes this title. There's no real explanation for why he deliberately misspells the words Inglorious Bastards, but he does. The Italian movie does not do that in translation. So there's a couple of possibilities that are out there on the internet. One is that that when Tarantino wrote this script, it was leaked to the internet, and in the leaked script, it had this misspelling. So perhaps it was an actual mistake, but once it got leaked to the internet, Tarantino decided to own the mistake and not change the spelling just because it was incorrect. The other thing is that perhaps you may have noticed, it goes by very quickly, that this is carved into the rifle stock of the character Aldo Raine that Brad Pitt plays. So so perhaps the suggestion is that Lieutenant Aldo Raine from I believe he's also from Tennessee, like Quentin Tarantino himself. The thought would be that someone like Aldo Raine would actually misspell those words on his rifle, and therefore the title is misspelled. So that's probably a minor point. The movie was directed for, I believe, 8 Oscars. It won one. It won the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for Christoph Waltz, who later on won a second actor for Best Supporting Actor in another Tarantino movie, in Django Unchained. So, so in many ways, he owes his movie career to Quentin Tarantino, and the role in. So Tarantino wrote this script, and then said almost didn't make the movie because he couldn't find somebody to play the role, to play that role of Colonel Hans Landa. He was afraid that he had written a role that there was no actor on earth that could play it. And then he met Christoph Waltz, who came in to audition for it, and realized that it could be done. And so Christoph Waltz wins the Oscar for this. Then when Tarantino writes and directs Django Unchained, he wrote the role in that movie specifically for Christoph Waltz. And in some ways, it's the, here he plays such a horrible, sadistic, and difficult character in some ways. In Django Unchained, he's kind of the conscience of the movie. So it's almost as if the movies are in dialogue with each other. That's fairly typical of Tarantino. There's things in this movie that show up again in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and things very much very self-conscious of what's in his movies and bringing things back and forth between them. So the idea that he wrote another character for Christoph Waltz to redeem the character that he plays in this movie, I think is quite possible, an intentional thing that he did here. So Christoph Waltz, interesting, he was born in Austria in 1956. His first wife was Jewish. She was a dance therapist, and his children from that marriage, one of them spent a number of years studying in yeshiva in Israel, although he's a scientist who lives, I think, in London. And his daughter Rachel got married in Israel a few years ago. So he's must be an interesting fellow. I think it might be interesting to have a conversation with him sometime. A couple of the other people who appear in this movie, Eli Roth is better known as a director. I mean, he plays the character Sergeant Donnie Donowitz, also known as the Bear Jew in this movie. He's best known for directing and producing horror movies in his own right, particularly a series of movies called Hostel, Hostel 2 and Hostel 3. His very first movie was a short subject. It was a spoof called Restaurant Dogs, which, if you know Quentin Tarantino, the first movie he directed was a movie called Reservoir Dogs. So Eli Roth's first movie is a spoof of Tarantino movies, which undoubtedly Tarantino saw and struck up a friendship with Eli Roth. And so Roth ends up here in this movie. He's not the only actor, and and director who's in this movie. One of the other soldiers in Aldo Rain's platoon is a German actor. The internet calls him Germany's best known actor and director, a guy named Till Schweiger. He plays Hugo Stiglitz in this movie, the German soldier who turns against the German army, right, and is freed from prison by the bastards. He's not particularly well known in America, I don't think, although you may have recognized his face. I mean, he shows up here and there in relatively small roles, but he's a much bigger, better known actor and director in Germany. And one movie that I did see him in there was a movie about Joe Louis and Max Schmeling a number of years ago that attempts to other things set sort of the historical record about Joe Louis and Max Schmeling correctly. Schmeling was actually never a backer of the Nazis. That was more of a concoction of news media, right? That it was America against the Nazis when Joe Louis fought Max Schmeling. And so this movie called Joe and Max, Till Schweiger actually plays Max Schmeling, the boxer, in that movie. That's from 2002, so about 7 years before this movie. So a couple of, I won't say much about Brad Pitt. I mean, born in Dallas, he became pretty well known. I'm sorry, born in Oklahoma. He actually appeared in the TV series Dallas. A little mix up there. And but perhaps really came on the scene with his appearance in the movie Thelma and Louise in 1991. He appears in a movie that was written by Tarantino, but not directed by him, in 1993, called True Romance. So his connection to Tarantino goes way back. And of course, he also won an Oscar in a Tarantino movie, just that movie we mentioned, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He wins the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for that. He's actually been nominated for Oscars 3 times, I think, as an actor, including Once Upon a Time, but also for 12 Monkeys and Benjamin Button. And twice he's been nominated for an Oscar as a producer of a movie that was nominated for Best Film. The Big Short, actually 3 times, The Big Short and Moneyball, and then won an Oscar for Best Picture as the producer of 12 Years a Slave a few years ago. So he meets Diane Kruger on the set of a movie called Troy in 2004, where he plays Achilles and she plays Helen of Troy. She was Bridget von Hammersmark, the German actress in this movie, and she is indeed a German actress. Who have I left out? Shoshana, the actress who plays her, is named Melanie Laurent. She is actually Jewish, from a Jewish family, even with those green eyes. And according to her story, her grandfather, after reading the script, she shared it with him, and he said, "You have to make this movie, please." So she appears as Shoshana in this movie. She's been in a few other things. You might recognize her in France. She's from Paris. Her parents, one is of Tunisian Jewish descent, the other is of Polish Jewish descent. But she's best known in France for voiceover work, particularly appearing in the French language version of The Simpsons. So you may have recognized a few people in smaller roles. Michael Fassbender, who plays the former film critic, now Lieutenant Archie Hickox of German-Irish descent. Interestingly, in the movies, he's played Magneto in the X-Men movies. And if you know your X-Men Marvel Comics history, Magneto is actually a Jewish Holocaust survivor. So that's sort of interesting. Daniel Bruhl plays the sniper actor in this movie, Frederick Zoller, who he was born in Barcelona and grew up in Germany. His face may look familiar to you. He came on the scene in a movie called Goodbye Lenin. He was in the movie with Helen Mirren a few years ago called The Woman in Gold, about a stolen painting. On TV, I've enjoyed seeing him as the lead role in a show called The Alienist, based on mysteries by Caleb Carr, where he plays an early practitioner of psychiatry named Laszlo Kreisler, a Jewish psychiatrist who solves crimes in The Alienist. A couple of people who've become more famous since this movie, probably. Leah Seydoux, who is only in the opening scene as one of the daughters, Charlotte Lapadite, has been in a number of movies in recent years, including the most recent James Bond movie, and the French Dispatch, a Woody Allen movie called Midnight in Paris, and she's actually becoming quite famous. And B.J. Novak, who after this appeared in The Office on American TV, he plays Yudovich, the little Jew, is his nickname in the movie, right? He's actually born in Massachusetts to a Jewish family as well. And I'll just make mention of Mike Myers appearing, the comedian who appears in, I believe, just the one scene here as General Ed Fennick, who sends the film critic Archie Hickox onto this mission to blow up the theater. So, of course, better known for his Austin Powers movies and things like that. But interesting choice of actors in this part. Not uncommon for Tarantino to put people into a movie in just one scene. In Pulp Fiction, it's Christopher Walken just shows up for a brief moment, a pretty unforgettable one in that movie. So it's sort of almost, again, a kind of a regular occurrence in Tarantino movies. A couple of other people who are in a lot of Tarantino movies show up very briefly just as voices in this movie. One is Harvey Keitel, who's the voice on the telephone near the end when Hans Landa is making a deal for his, ending the war, right? So Harvey Keitel, who's also in Pulp Fiction and in Reservoir Dogs, and Samuel L. Jackson, who is in many of Tarantino's movies. He's the narrator in this movie. So I think I only noticed him twice, but a couple of times he just, his voice appears to explain something here and there. So a rather unusual sort of way that the movie kind of breaks the fourth wall here and there with just a few words from Quentin Tarantino. So the movie score itself is made up of songs from other movies. There's no original score to this movie. Every bit of it is from some other movie, from several pieces by a guy named Ennio Morricone, an Italian composer who does backgrounds for a lot of films, all the way to David Bowie, who his theme from Cat People shows up near the end of the movie in the movie theater scene. So the movie is told in chapters, I believe 5 chapters, if I'm not mistaken, and begins once upon a time in Nazi-occupied France, which, of course, I'm not presuming that Tarantino had already written the script for his more recent movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but I think those things, once again, there are these interconnections, from one Tarantino movie to another. And famously in his interviews, he actually says that he's sort of had these ideas from the beginning and has his whole career plotted out, all of the movies that he plans to make. And I've forgotten now how many he said he plans to make, but when he finishes the last one, he's going to retire. So he's had it all plotted out right from the beginning. There are, like Spielberg, this is an amazing director who wrings every bit of suspense out of every scene that he directs. And so it's, it may not be everybody's cup of tea, but it's a remarkable piece of work. Right? So point to that first chapter, the introduction of Hans Landa in the dairy farmer's home, and the suspense of the politeness of this seeming functionary who's, I just have a question, put this to rest, where is this family? Did you notice perhaps that the camera in this movie does not obey any physical laws, right? It goes down. There's a scene in this scene where the camera goes from the tabletop with the glass of milk down to the floor and through the floor to the Jews hiding beneath the floor. And it does this several times in the movie. It does this again in the later scene in the movie theater, where we see Shoshana getting ready, getting dressed. This is where the David Bowie song, the theme from Cat People, putting out a fire with gasoline, I think is the subtitle of the song. And she's putting on the makeup, and which is almost like donning war paint, right? That does that with the blush, right? And then blends it in. And then the camera rises up above her, goes through the wall out into the hallway as she walks out. So, the camera itself is reinforcing some of what's going on screen. As I said, that the movie doesn't care what the truth of history is, right? Nor does the camera care that there's a wall there, right? Or a floor there, or these things that would seem to be impediments to its going forward. And some of these scenes are true tour de force kinds of direction scenes. That very long take in the movie theater that follows Shoshana and then follows some other people and goes from the second floor to the first floor and back again, and spins around, follows a cigarette girl for a little while. It's really a remarkable piece of camera work that has been taken even farther in more recent movies, but really a great piece of cinematography and direction. So there's very little music in that first chapter. There are these moments of suspense are punctuated primarily with the sound of a clock ticking in the background, right? Very powerfully done, I think. It's really, that's all the start of the movie, right? It's all kind of a prelude to what goes on in the next chapters. So we're introduced to Colonel Landa, and in a way to Shoshana, although we don't really see much of her face at all. We just see her running off into the distance, and Colonel Landa saying, "Au revoir, Shoshana." So that cuts to chapter 2, which is the formation of the Inglorious Bastards, with Aldo Raine and his recruitment of these 8 with these Jewish soldiers whose only job is to kill Nazis, as he pronounces it, I believe. And he said, this is where we really get what I think at the heart of this movie is this revenge fantasy, a kind of a Jewish revenge fantasy about can do. He said, I didn't come here to teach Nazis lessons in humanity. Right? They're foot soldiers of a Jew hunting, mass murdering maniac, and they need to be destroyed. Right? And so there's and this is a relatively long monologue, which again is not so unusual in Tarantino movies. Somebody will give a monologue at some time or another. And he gives one here. He says, we will be cruel to the Germans, and by our cruelty, they will know who we are. So there are some mysterious elements in this movie. I don't know if you noticed that he has a scar on his throat, and no explanation of what that scar is. The original screenplay calls it a rope burn. So it looks almost like Aldo Rain has escaped a lynching. So not sure what to make of that, but it may be an homage to, there was a Clint Eastwood movie, which is a revenge movie called High Plains Drifter, where he plays a survivor of a lynching who comes back to, well, there's some question actually in that movie of whether he's a survivor or whether he's a ghost. But either way, Clint Eastwood comes back and takes vengeance on the people who lynched him. So there may be some of a kind of a reference to that revenge fantasy movie, High Plains Drifter, in this. So the Tarantino movies in general are very sort of self-referential about movies and making movies, and so that wouldn't be surprising if that's what's going on there. Later on, of course, we have scenes in the movie theater where the movie theater, someone even says your movie theater is very beautiful. It's like a church, which strikes me as a very Tarantino thing to say. I mean, the sanctity of the movie theater, is very important to him. And as I said, the only thing that's true in this movie are the references to other movies, right? When Shoshana meets the young soldier, the sniper, right? Frederick Zoller, she's taking down the marquee for a movie that she's been showing, Piz Palu, a German mountain film from 1929. One of the stars of it is Lenny Riefenstahl, whose name you may know. She's a very controversial figure in history. She made the German movie about the Olympics. I think it might be called Olympiad, 1936. So not long after the rise of Hitler. And then even more controversially, he made Triumph of the Will, a movie about the sort of a movie glorifying the Nuremberg rallies and the rise of Hitler. But in Piz Palu from 1929, she's an actress in that. So that's the movie that's being shown. It's the director's name is on the marquee, G.W. Pabst, who was a German director from the 1920s to the 1950s. Certainly was considered to be one of the great German directors. His story is a little convoluted, but he was trying to get out of Nazi Germany. He got caught in Paris trying to leave and was forced to go back to Germany, and ended up making a couple of movies during World War II. He also makes the first movie in Germany that has Hitler as a character in it, in The Last 10 Days, which he made in 1955, about a year before he died. which is really about the Hitler's last days in the bunker. So again, probably not an accident that Tarantino found a movie that stars Lenny Riefenstahl and is directed by G.W. Pabst and has those names on the marquee. He asks her what movie's coming next, and she tells him that they're going to have a Max Linder festival. So that's a name that only a true film lover knows, probably. Max Linder is a slapstick comedian from France who predates actually Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, those guys, but was a huge star, particularly in France, but also in the United States, really the first big star of silent comedians, right? Before Harold Lloyd, before any of those guys. So they're having a Max Linder festival. And I suppose it's probably also not an accident that why Max Linder? Well, Max Linder fought in World War I after becoming a big star in the movies, and actually is injured in World War I. He lives with chronic pain until he kills himself and his young wife in 1925. It's either a suicide pact or it might be a murder-suicide. I'm not sure anybody really knows, but the fact that this is a suicide mission is, again, probably not, Tarantino could have chosen anybody, right? And he chooses Max Linder. So I think that's all a part of this. So I want to give others a chance to talk about it. It's like the movie we talked about last week. It's a pretty complicated script, so pretty complicated text to talk about in less than an hour. But it's I think quite remarkable in many ways. And what do you guys have to say? Watching for hands and yeah, Brenda.
In the beginning, why do you think that the Christoph Waltz, Colonel or whatever, why do you think he let the little Shoshana go? I mean, he could have shot her, but I was curious what your take on that was.
Yeah, it's hard to answer, right? I mean, does he think he can't make that shot? Maybe. Does he think that she's no danger? Maybe, right? The text is not really clear. Then you kind of wonder at the end, right? They meet each other again, of course, right? Mm-hmm. They meet each other in the restaurant. I mean, he orders her a glass of milk. Does he already know who she is, right? The text is not abundantly clear, but there's certainly plenty of suggestion that as part of his cat and mouse game, if you like, and that's kind of quite literal to how he sees himself as the hunter of Jews. He can think like a rat, that he's hedging his bets all along for what will happen at the end of the war. Right. So it's possible that all of that is part of his contrivance for how he gets to his place on Nantucket by the end of the movie. Right. So, yeah, Hubie.
Okay. Yes. On this thing about letting her escape, one thing I'm sure that most of the people in this organization don't realize that a pistol has very limited accuracy. And given the distance that they showed, his probability of hitting her after a couple of seconds was nil.
Yeah.
And I think, but again, coming back, this director, the way you explain it, he's very, very clever.
Uh-huh.
But yeah. I got to tell you, I found this movie initially really upsetting.
Yeah.
I really thought, why in the heck is Rabbi Ike picking this movie?
Yeah.
I had a very difficult time with that.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking that it was like a shoot 'em up Western around Jews. I mean,
Yeah.
And then this guy's pretty brilliant. And am I wrong? But I think a lot of the scenes, there seemed to be a moral thing going through it.
Yeah, I think so, right? And you know, I've been watching it again. Part of me is saying, why did I ask people to watch this movie?
Okay.
You know, I'm going to say, you know, I get it, right? You know, and as I said, I'm the way it departs from history is so disturbing in some ways that in itself is disturbing, aside from the violence and that sort of thing. I mean, which, you know, is certainly very disturbing. And we don't like the idea, generally speaking, we don't like the idea of vengeance, right? And that's what this movie is all about, you know, and it's a Western, right? By the way, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Once Upon a Time in Nazi-occupied France, right? Both those words are sort of homage to a movie made in Italy in the 1960s, I think, Once Upon a Time in the West, right? So it's already an homage to the Western, you know, all the way through. So it's, you know, so in that sense, you know, it's quite definitely a Western in that sense. And yeah, there are these questions about sort of what's moral. I mean, and you know, who's the real sort of, is there any moral hero in this movie? Well, I think that the one that certainly I would say comes closest is Shoshana. I mean, she's the real conscience of this movie, and she is avenging her own family's death, right? And she's ready to give up her own life, which she does. She expects to give up her own life in doing this, you know, and there's a kind of a moral courage in that. I see some other hands. Let me get, I think Joanne, you've been waiting for a while, and then Sandy. Can you unmute, Joanne?
Trying. Okay, there. Took me a minute. Sorry. I'm glad you said that you questioned yourself about why you assigned this. Bob and I started watching it together Saturday evening, and within about 45 minutes, he left the room. He couldn't take it anymore, and the violence was overwhelming. And it was for me too. I left a while later and went back and finished it Sunday morning, but the actual horrors related to the war, combined with what we're seeing on the nightly news every night now in Ukraine, it's like, why do we have to put ourselves through this? If God forbid we were in the midst of something like this, we would survive it. We would deal with it. But I just kept wanting the perfect antidote to this movie, which I think is the producers.
Yeah.
And that, in its own way, in its very humorous way, gets revenge, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I just read an article recently. I'm not sure I can do justice to the argument, but you know, that one of our responses to Nazism is to laugh at it, right? And this article was suggesting that with the rise of anti-Semitism in the world, with things that are going on, you know, this was probably written even before the invasion of Ukraine, but that maybe we don't have the luxury of laughing at it anymore, you know, which is interesting to think about. That you know, there was certainly when Mel Brooks wrote The Producers, there was certainly this feeling that the best way, in some ways, to deal with the ridiculousness of neo-Nazism is to make fun of the people who believe in it, right? But you know, with this resurgence in anti-Semitism here and around the world, it's got to be taken seriously, and so how we're going to deal with that is another question, I suppose, but worth thinking about.
Rabbi?
But, I appreciate that it was difficult to sit through the violence in this movie. Again, I'd say directors make movies. Persuasive directors really work on our emotions. The fact that it's repellent is part of the fact that it's well directed.
And it's
Rabbi.
Sorry, Sandy.
I remember years ago when we went to see this film in a theater, and I couldn't take it. I remember leaving after about 20 minutes. I just felt sick, and I couldn't believe that anyone would make a film like that. And then when you assigned it, I decided I would try it again and see if now I'm more mature, maybe I could take it. And I really hated it. I watched the whole thing.
Yeah.
I thought Christoph Waltz really deserved the Oscar, but watching Brad Pitt in that horrible role was just horrible.
Yeah. Well, that's our discomfort with vengeance, right?
Yes.
Our sense of the best vengeance is to live morally and well, right?
Right.
And that's not his character, right? His character is, he says, I'm not here to teach them, I'm not here to teach them manners, right?
And I
think that it's not my discomfort with vengeance. It's a discomfort with this awful brutality.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to, I respect, everything that everybody said. I still think it was a good assignment for all kinds of reasons, and which we've touched on. But I just want to put in a word for comedy, which is always a powerful tool, and taking a comedic view toward truth, toward telling the truth, is just as serious and important. You just come at it a different way. I'm sure we all remember The Dictator, Charlie Chaplin's The Dictator, that came out, one of the most important and potent films, making just these points, using, I would say, pathos and humor. But I don't think of comedy necessarily has to be the light, unserious thing. Comedy is a tool to teach us in the same way. It's the other side of tragedy, and it is just as powerful. So I just had to put that point in.
Right, and some of you watched The Great Dictator with me. It was one of the first movies we watched, actually, was Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah.
So, do I see other hands? See, Brenda? Yeah.
So for all the Holocaust deniers, I think it was a perfect ending. That Aldo, rather than kill the Christoph Waltz character, branded a swastika on his head, so he could never say that he wasn't involved in this. I mean, that was almost better than killing him.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's what he says essentially, is like, you're going to take this uniform off. They make that point a couple of times, and then how will we know that you did this? By the way, once upon a time in Hollywood,
what do you need to?
With Charles Manson and the Manson murderers, you may remember that Charles Manson famously carved a swastika into his own head in prison, right? So, this idea of a swastika on someone's forehead, it's in another Tarantino movie. It's very strange how these things are intertwined, and I do believe, in a sense, that Tarantino has this all sort of worked out ahead, that I'm going to make this movie, then I'm going to make that movie. It's pretty fascinating in terms of a career. Sorry about the dog. The male must be here.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, what good does this fictionalized revenge do to us as Jews do we need it when we know that this is all fake? It's not true.
Just go.
Well, first of all, I'd say that if you asked Tarantino that question, he said he would probably say something like, "I have no intention of weighing into this question of whether it's good or not,
My daughter drove
for the Jews or for anybody else." Right? I mean, that's his intention is to make an entertaining movie, and that's what he set out to do, right? But somebody needs to mute. I'm not sure who that is.
Maybe she says it stinks of cigarettes.
Sandy has to mute herself. Sandy, yeah.
So that's what Vanessa does when she's here. She mutes. Leave their mic open. But anyway, let's say that we sort of have our own version of this. I mean, we've just finished Purim, right? And the story of Esther is a revenge fantasy. We take out our revenge on Haman. Now, this is a part of the story that we usually don't spend much time on or read, but the Jews kill off Haman, all of his sons, his whole family. The sons are all mentioned by name. They all get hanged in the public square. They wipe out all of Haman's followers. I forget how many thousands of people, according to the story of Esther. Now, we know that the story of Esther itself is as fictional as, it's not even considered the same as the rest of the Bible, even by very traditional people, right? So that story in itself is a revenge fantasy. I'm not suggesting that Tarantino actually was smart enough to know that, because I doubt that he was, but we have these stories, right? So all he does is update the Queen Esther story to the 20th century. In that sense. So, Alice?
Yeah, I missed the beginning. So tell me if you've already talked about this, but I kept thinking of Schindler's List because the movies were paired, and of course they're both about the Holocaust. So I mean, in my mind, I was diametrically opposed in terms of the approach and the telling of the story. But I would like to hear you or anybody else talking about that comparison some more.
Yeah, I did talk about that a little right at the beginning, but it bears repeating perhaps after we've talked about it a little bit too, right? Is that Spielberg set out to make a movie that was as close to a documentary, or at least that looked like a documentary, to prove that the Holocaust happened the way history tells us that it happened, right? And Tarantino, it seems to me, goes into this with the complete opposite idea, right? He creates a fantasy. And not only, does he create the fantasy in the story, it's not just at the level of narrative, but again, remember how Spielberg uses the handheld camera and things like that to make it look like documentary footage, like he's just editing things that really happened, to this movie with its shots from cranes and going through walls and going through floors. And, one of my favorites, it's just a little, it's maybe a couple of seconds of screen time near the end where the two soldiers pretending to be Italians are sitting in their seats in the movie theater, and the film does this little like X-ray circle and shows the dynamite strapped to their legs underneath their pants, right? Yeah. So the camera has gone through the pants. You get what I'm saying? I mean, it's so completely artifice, right? It's that the technique of the movie is the opposite of Schindler's List. The story is the opposite. The intention is the opposite. The filmmaking itself is the opposite, right? The bright colors compared to the black and white of Schindler's List, right? Every part of this, it's almost like you can't say for sure that he was thinking this, but every step along the way, Tarantino is doing. What would Spielberg do? I'm going to do the opposite, right? So So I think that in itself makes putting the two of them, that's why I put them together, right? Is to show those things 2 weeks in a row to get you to see that the opposition, in a sense, of these two movies. And so I said, the fear will be and one of the things that makes this movie disturbing is the idea that anybody might mistake this movie for history. So we are just about out of time.
I got a comment.
Yeah, Julie? And Elaine? First Julie, then Elaine.
Another revisionist story was Philip Roth's The Plot Against America.
Yeah.
What would have happened if Lindbergh had been elected president? But
Right.
that's a much more plausible story. I mean, that's something that could have happened and how that would have affected our country in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So when I see this movie, which I thought was extremely clever, I think it's problematic as far as revisionist history goes. But if something like this had happened and Hitler and all of those people had been bombed in that theater and that had stopped the war and stopped the Holocaust, that would have, that if something like that could have happened, and there had been attempts on Hitler's life, which failed, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but had this actually been able to be pulled off, then we would look at it in a different way.
Yeah.
But I think compared to The Plot Against America, which I thought was really an excellent book, and the PBS series on it was outstanding, but that, at least you can watch that and think, gee, this could have happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there certainly are, there's no shortage of sort of speculative fiction books and movies, right? I mean, how would history have been different? If this had happened, if that had happened, there are many examples of that. So this I think is that, but it's something else too. It's this I don't know what to call it other than a fantasy, right? Which is somehow different than a science fiction sort of revision or a thing of a what if kind of thing. So who was the last person? I lost track.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Twice in the movie, there's 3 glasses. What's the significance of the 3 glasses? It shows up in the bar and then it shows up again later on. And there's 3.
Where's the first one you're talking about in the basement bar, right? Where in the
basement bar, right? He offers drinks and only 3 people want it. Yeah.
Right.
And then towards the end, he's going to pour a drink and he has 3 glasses. Okay. I'm not exactly sure where it happens, but
I have to admit I didn't catch it, so I'm not sure. I mean, is it Colonel Landa is going to pour the 3 glasses? Is that in the movie theater? I'll have to go back and take a look for that.
The Nazi is going to pour 3 glasses.
Yeah. So he at that point, I mean, knows who was in the basement, right? I mean, he knows about the 3 glasses of scotch.
Yeah. I wondered if the 3 has something significance.
Yeah. Not that I know of.
Okay.
Doesn't jump to mind, but I'll have to go back and take a look. But it might suggest, as I've said earlier, that Landa is kind of hedging his bets all through this movie and always knows more than he says, right? Wherever he is, so that even the 3 glasses there might mean something. So, but I have to admit I didn't catch it. So
okay,
go back and see if I see it. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you for being with us. And this finishes our latest group of 8 pictures. We're going to take a brief break. I'm going to teach something a little more intellectual for a few weeks, and then we'll come back to movies again. So keep an eye out for what we're going to do. We're going to do kind of an abbreviated spring group of classes. I'm going to do something on gender in Judaism, I think, and how it's been treated throughout Jewish history. So keep an eye out for that. Great.
Could be
Thanks,
interesting.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure. It's nice to see you all.